I had just finished a long day, the kind of day where your brain feels like scrambled eggs and all you want is to collapse on your couch. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I felt that familiar sigh of relief. My little suburban house, with its freshly painted shutters and neatly trimmed lawn, always felt like my sanctuary. Today, however, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the light hit the windows of the neighbor's house across the street. Maybe it was the silence in the neighborhood, too quiet for this late hour. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed her, Karen's thin, angular face peeking through the blinds. Of course, it was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood and the unofficial director of everyone else's lives. She always seemed to know what you were doing before you even did it. Her hair, perfectly coiffed, framed a face that somehow managed to be both sweet and terrifying at the same time. I waved casually, hopping to avoid confrontation, but she didn't wave back. Her eyes, sharp as daggers, followed me like a hawk circling its prey. I shrugged off the unease and headed toward my front door. I reached for the key, slid it into the lock, and turned it, the familiar click of the deadbolt echoing like a small declaration of independence. This was my house. My rules. My door, locked or unlocked, should not have caused a scene. Yet I had this nagging feeling that the simple act of locking my own door had been observed, recorded, and judged. Little did I know, Karen's son had witnessed the entire crime. He probably saw me lock the door and ran straight to his mother, fully convinced that some terrible catastrophe was unfolding. Inside, I tossed my keys onto the counter, kicked off my shoes, and tried to relax. The living room smelled faintly of the dinner I had cooked earlier, a comforting mixture of garlic, onions, and slightly overcooked chicken. I sank into the couch, trying to focus on the mundane pleasures of home, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the gentle rustle of leaves outside. And then I heard it. A faint tapping at the window, a shadow moving across the blinds. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of that nagging, creeping awareness that Karen's gaze was still locked on me. I laughed to myself. I mean, really, who does this? I was grown, independent, and perfectly capable of locking my own door. Yet here I was, under the scrutiny of a neighbor who seemed to believe she had a divine mandate to oversee everyone's daily activities. I shook my head and muttered, maybe I should just start wearing a trench coat and hat indoors so she doesn't recognize me. The thought made me chuckle, but it also highlighted just how tense things were about to become. The next few minutes passed in uneasy silence. I moved around my house, trying to busy myself with chores, washing dishes, checking the mail, rearranging the living room pillows. Each time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see Karen hovering, clipboard in hand, taking notes on my behavior. The suspense built with every tick of the clock. My peaceful evening had vanished, replaced by the absurd dread that some kind of neighborhood catastrophe was imminent, all because I had locked my own door. And then it happened. A sound that shattered my brief moment of calm, a distant but unmistakable siren. I froze. Sirens at this hour, in my quiet little street. It had to be a coincidence, right? I peered out the window and saw the flashing lights approaching, reflecting off the roofs and parked cars. Something told me this wasn't just a random emergency. I swallowed hard, a sinking feeling in my stomach. Karen's son had already called 911, spinning some wildly exaggerated story about me being trapped or endangered. The thought was almost laughable. Me, in my own home, perfectly fine, potentially the subject of an emergency response team. But it also sent a shiver down my spine. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself. I knew I should take a deep breath, remind myself that it was just a misunderstanding. But the suspense was electric. The sirens grew louder, each flash of light in the window a reminder that the neighborhood was watching, waiting, and possibly judging. The quiet, normal life I had enjoyed for so long had been replaced by something tense, absurd, and completely unpredictable. I realized, in that moment, that the simple act of locking a door could set off a chain reaction far beyond anything I had imagined. I took another breath, steeling myself for what was to come. This was only the beginning. I was just starting to convince myself that maybe the sirens were for someone else when the unmistakable sound of a police car rolling up my street snapped me out of any lingering calm. The lights reflected off my windows in quick, dizzying bursts. My stomach knotted, and a strange mix of disbelief and irritation washed over me. All this for a locked door, a door that belonged to me. I wanted to laugh, but there was an edge of tension in the air that made laughter feel wrong. I stepped cautiously to the front window, peering through the blinds. The first patrol car pulled up directly in front of my house, and the officer inside was already speaking into his radio. Behind him, more cars rolled up, lights flashing, creating a strange spectacle in what had been moments ago a perfectly normal suburban evening. My neighbors were starting to emerge, faces pressed against windows, some holding phones, ready to record. The thought that my simple action had become a neighborhood event made my chest tight. And then I remembered Karen's son. That little whirlwind of overreaction had called 911, and now the results were tangible. Lights, sirens, police officers looking as confused as I felt. I could almost hear him narrating the story in his head, dramatically gesturing as he explained the danger of a locked door. In reality, the only danger was to my sanity and maybe to my blood pressure. I grabbed the doorknob, preparing to step outside and explain things before they escalated further. My mind raced through all the possible scenarios. What if the officers assumed there was a break-in? What if Karen had added some wildly exaggerated details to her son's version of events? What if the entire neighborhood had already formed their own theories and opinions before I even opened my mouth? As I swung the door open, I forced a calm smile, raising my hands slightly in a gesture of peace. The first officer looked at me, blinking, obviously trying to reconcile the report he had received with the calm, very much not in peril homeowner standing before him. I started to explain, "Hello, officers, everything's fine. It seems there was a misunderstanding." And then, as if on cue, Karen appeared. She glided across the lawn with the poise of someone delivering a royal decree, her expression a mixture of outrage and incredulity. "You didn't warn us," she snapped, pointing a finger at me, as though my lack of communication constituted a crime against the neighborhood. The officers looked from me to her, their eyebrows raised. The tension in the air thickened. I tried to respond politely, my voice steady despite the absurdity of the situation. "I locked my door, that's all. I live here, it's my house. No one is trapped, no one is hurt." But Karen's fury did not abate. Instead, she escalated, citing vaguely remembered safety regulations and insinuating that my locked door posed a threat to the entire block. I watched the officers, who now looked between us like referees trying to keep two wildly mismatched opponents from coming to blows. Neighbors had begun to gather along the street, peering from behind hedges and fences, whispering, giggling, some recording on their phones. I could feel their eyes on me, and an odd mix of embarrassment and dark amusement settled over me. The suspense was electric, each second stretching longer than the last. The absurdity of it all only heightened the tension. How had a locked door become a neighborhood emergency? Karen's son had appeared now, standing behind her, nodding enthusiastically as if to say, "See, Mom, I told you." The sight of him only added fuel to the fire. He looked proud, like a hero reporting an imminent disaster. In reality, the only casualty here was common sense. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation before it spiraled completely. "Officers," I said calmly, "please, you don't need to worry. I'm fine, my house is fine, and this is a complete misunderstanding." One officer nodded slowly, looking relieved but still cautious. Another officer scribbled something in a notebook, no doubt preparing for the report he would have to write about a locked door emergency that didn't exist. And through it all, Karen stood there, fuming, her gaze burning into me like a laser. The suspense of the situation hung over the street, the tension so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Every second felt drawn out, every movement observed, every word weighed and measured. I realized then that this was only the beginning. The locked door had set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond this evening, and there was no telling how far Karen would go to make this a crisis. I closed the door slowly, letting the officers peek in one more time, and waited. The next chapter of this suburban saga was about to begin, and somehow, I had a feeling it would be even more ridiculous than the first. The police cars hadn't moved. They just sat there, lights flashing like some bizarre suburban parade, while I stood at my doorway trying to figure out what the proper protocol was for being accused of locking your own house. I waved at the first officer again, a little more cautiously this time. "Hello, officers. Really, it's fine," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost soothing. One of them, a tall man with a weary expression, stepped forward and raised a hand. "We just want to make sure everything's okay," he said. His tone was polite but firm, and I could tell he was fighting the urge to roll his eyes. I smiled and nodded. "Yes, everything is okay. There's no emergency." Just as I started to feel that maybe the situation could be resolved quickly, Karen arrived on the scene like she had been waiting for the perfect moment. She swept across the lawn, hair perfectly in place despite the wind, and planted herself directly in front of my door. Her eyes were sharp, scanning me as if she were inspecting a criminal mastermind. "How could you not warn anyone?" she demanded. "This is reckless, dangerous, and completely unacceptable." I blinked. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I wanted to say anything, to explain that locking your own door did not, in fact, constitute a threat to the neighborhood. But Karen had already launched into a full speech. She spoke of safety, responsibility, and neighborhood protocol, throwing around terms that sounded serious but made very little sense in context. I tried not to laugh, but a small, nervous chuckle escaped, which only seemed to enrage her further. The officer standing closest to me scribbled in his notebook, looking between Karen and me like he was watching a live performance he hadn't signed up for. "Ma'am," he said, glancing at Karen, "are we certain this is actually an emergency?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "It's an emergency of principle," she snapped. You can't just lock a door without notifying the neighborhood. What if something happened? What if someone was trapped? What if the mailman was confused?" I paused. The mailman, that was the crisis. I had to fight back a laugh. I took a deep breath and said calmly, "Officers, I can assure you no one is trapped. The mailman is fine. I locked my door, that is all." Her son, standing behind her, nodded enthusiastically, as though he were validating a heroic story he had created in his own mind. He probably imagined himself as some kind of neighborhood savior, preventing disaster with a simple phone call. I wondered briefly if he would grow up and tell this story at family gatherings, a tale of how he had once saved the neighborhood from the horrors of a locked door. The tension on the street was palpable. Neighbors were starting to gather, peering over fences, whispering and pointing. Some were filming, phones raised, capturing the spectacle for posterity or perhaps a future viral video. I felt like I was trapped in a sitcom, only with real consequences if Karen decided to escalate things further. As I tried to keep the situation under control, I realized the absurdity of it all. A locked door had summoned police officers, gathered neighbors, and summoned Karen in all her dramatic fury. I felt a mix of disbelief and amusement. It was impossible, yet it was happening right in front of me. One officer took a step closer, clearly trying to mediate. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "sometimes people lock their doors for privacy or security. It doesn't necessarily mean there's an emergency." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "But it's inconsiderate," she argued, gesturing wildly toward me. "How can anyone know what's happening if the door is locked? It's a threat to the community." I wanted to point out that a locked door is the definition of privacy, not danger, but I held my tongue. Instead, I tried a different approach. "Karen, please, I live here. My door is locked because it's my house. I'm safe, my home is safe, and everything is fine. No one is in danger." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure what to do next. Karen's son was bouncing on the balls of his feet, thrilled that he had initiated a full-scale neighborhood response. Neighbors whispered, some stifling laughs, others genuinely concerned. The suspense had reached a fever pitch. Every second felt drawn out, every movement scrutinized. I could feel the absurdity building, like a pot about to boil over. This was no longer just about a locked door. It was about pride, control, and Karen's relentless need to assert dominance over the block. And I had no idea how far she would go, but I knew one thing. This was only the beginning of a very long, very ridiculous saga. Just when I thought the chaos might settle, Karen's obsession escalated to a new level. Locking my door had apparently transcended a minor neighborhood incident and now required the attention of the entire HOA. I found myself staring at a thick envelope that had arrived the next morning, stamped with the HOA logo, and my heart sank. Inside was a formal complaint, a meticulously typed letter outlining my reckless behavior and how it endangered the neighborhood. I almost laughed out loud. It was absurd, and yet here it was, official and binding, or at least pretending to be. The letter accused me of failing to notify neighbors when locking my door, violating some unwritten neighborhood code, and creating unnecessary stress for residents. It referenced safety and community standards in a way that made me wonder if Karen had secretly enrolled in a course on how to write reports that sounded serious while saying absolutely nothing. The absurdity of it all made me pause. I could practically hear her dramatic narration of the scene. My neighbor locked his door. Panic ensued. I acted immediately to protect the neighborhood. I set the letter down and stared out the window. Karen was outside, clipboard in hand, packing her front lawn as if rehearsing for the next round. I couldn't help but imagine her preparing a PowerPoint presentation for the HOA, complete with graphs and charts demonstrating how locked doors were slowly undermining community safety. The thought was ridiculous, but the tension she created was very real. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering and shaking their heads. The street had become a stage, and Karen was performing like it was opening night. I tried to brush it off and continue with my day, but it was impossible. Every knock at the door, every rustle in the yard made me jump. I half expected a neighborhood meeting to materialize on my doorstep at any moment, complete with coffee, name tags, and a detailed debate on the proper etiquette of locking doors. The suspense was relentless, and Karen was the master puppeteer. And then it hit me, the complaint wasn't just a warning. It included a notice that the HOA intended to discuss the matter at the next board meeting, a full-scale discussion of my locked door, as if it were a national security threat. I could feel the absurdity of the situation gnawing at my nerves, and yet somehow making it impossible to turn away. The suspense was maddening. I knew everyone in the neighborhood would be watching, ready to see who would blink first. Neighbors began to murmur, some siding with me, others visibly nervous about being caught in Karen's crosshairs. Suddenly, every casual conversation over the fence, every wave from across the street, felt loaded with tension. The sense of anticipation was thick. I had become the focal point of a drama that no one had asked for but everyone seemed compelled to witness. As the days passed, Karen's antics only grew bolder. She wrote follow-up emails, copied other neighbors, and suggested alternative safety measures like color-coded door indicators or neighborhood door watch schedules. I read these with a mix of disbelief and amusement. She had officially turned my personal choice to lock a door into a full-scale community event. The suspense was relentless. Every morning, I would wake up wondering if there would be another letter, another phone call, another unannounced visit from Karen herself. The tension made it impossible to relax. I found myself panicking, checking locks, imagining the worst-case scenario. The entire neighborhood gathered outside my house for a dramatic intervention about my door. And yet, the humor of it all made me smirk in spite of the anxiety. The climax of this part of the saga was the realization that Karen had mobilized more than just herself. She had enlisted the neighborhood, the HOA, and apparently even her own son, who seemed to delight in recounting the dangerous event to anyone who would listen. Every conversation with a neighbor felt like navigating a minefield of opinions and whispers, the suspense of who would side with whom keeping me constantly on edge. It was in this moment, standing alone in my living room, staring at the envelope and imagining the upcoming meeting, that I realized the absurd truth. The locked door was no longer about security. It was about control, attention, and Karen's relentless need to dominate every aspect of the neighborhood. And I had no choice but to prepare for the next stage of this ridiculous, suspense-filled saga. By now, it seemed like the entire neighborhood had decided my locked door was the event of the season. Every glance out my window revealed curious faces, some whispering, some pointing, and some openly shaking their heads at the audacity of what I had done. It was as if the simple act of securing my own home had transformed me into a spectacle, a character in a drama no one wanted to miss. I started noticing subtle shifts in behavior. Neighbors who used to smile politely now gave me long, measured looks when I stepped outside. Some muttered under their breath, careful to avoid eye contact, as if acknowledging me would somehow make them complicit in the alleged danger of my door. Others, more daring, waved enthusiastically, a mix of support and amusement on their faces. It was hard to tell who was taking sides and who was simply enjoying the show. The tension grew during casual encounters. One afternoon, I walked to my mailbox and found Mrs. Harrison, an elderly neighbor, lingering with a cautious smile. "I heard about the door situation," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret from a spy thriller. "People are well, everyone's talking." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. The suspense in her voice was almost tangible. Every word felt like it carried weight, as though she was reporting from the front lines of an invisible conflict. Meanwhile, Karen's son had clearly taken on a leadership role in this neighborhood drama. I spotted him one morning, packing across the street, gesturing wildly to an imaginary audience, recounting the emergency to anyone who would listen. He looked so proud of himself, so heroic, it was almost inspiring. Almost. I fought back laughter, imagining the story he would someday tell at family gatherings, about the day he saved the neighborhood from the peril of a locked door. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, going about my daily routines, but every knock at the door, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. The suspense was relentless. Even simple chores like taking out the trash became exercises in caution. I half expected the entire street to appear behind me, taking notes, whispering, or filming for posterity. The absurdity of it all was matched only by the palpable tension that seemed to hang over the block like a storm cloud. It didn't help that the neighborhood grapevine was working overtime. Whispers and rumors circulated about how dangerous my behavior was, how it threatened community safety, and most absurdly, how it demonstrated a lack of consideration for others. The gossip added another layer of suspense, because I never knew what I would hear next or who might show up on my doorstep to confront me. The anticipation was exhausting, but strangely addictive. Neighbors began forming subtle alliances. Some waved supportively, others avoided my gaze entirely. It was a delicate dance of social positioning, and I was at the center. Every interaction carried the unspoken question, who would side with Karen and who would see reason? The suspense was tangible, each encounter loaded with unspoken drama. And then came the day of the casual confrontation. I was outside watering my plants when Mr. Jenkins from 2 doors down stopped by. He shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable. About your door," he said hesitantly. "People are well, they're a little worried." I tried to suppress a laugh, taking a slow sip of water. "It's locked," I said plainly. "I'm fine. My house is fine. Nothing bad is happening." He nodded, unconvinced, glancing nervously down the street, as if expecting a crisis to erupt at any moment. By the end of the week, I realized something remarkable. Karen had succeeded in turning the neighborhood into a suspenseful audience, each resident waiting for the next act. Every small movement I made, every glance out my window was scrutinized. The tension was electric. It wasn't just about a door anymore. It was about control, reputation, and the subtle theater of suburban life. Standing on my porch one evening, I watched the sun dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street. Neighbors whispered to one another, some shaking their heads, some smirking, and some simply watching in awe. The suspense was relentless, but it also had a strange energy to it, a rhythm that kept me alert and in a weird way entertained. I knew Karen wasn't done. She never was. The next chapter of this suburban drama would come, and I had to be ready. This was the moment I realized that a locked door could do more than secure a house. It could hold an entire neighborhood in suspense, keep them talking, and somehow make me the unwilling protagonist of a story I never asked to star in. I realized I couldn't avoid Karen forever. The tension was building every day, every glance from a neighbor, every whispered conversation across the street, a reminder that the saga of the locked door was far from over. I had to face her directly, before things spiraled into something even more ridiculous. So one afternoon, I took a deep breath, stepped outside, and walked across the street. Karen was already there, standing like a general surveying her battlefield, clipboard in hand, her expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. As I approached, she fixed me with that piercing gaze that seemed designed to strip away any confidence I had left. "We need to talk," I said calmly. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened over the past week. The sirens, the police, the letters, the gossip, it all led to this moment. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Oh, we will talk," she said, her tone sharp, almost theatrical. I started carefully, trying to explain the obvious. "Karen, locking my door is not a crime. I live here, I'm safe, the house is fine, nothing bad is happening." She interrupted, waving her hand dramatically. "That's not the point. It's about responsibility. It's about consideration. It's about you not thinking about the community before making a decision." I blinked. I tried to respond, but she continued, rattling off complaints that seemed to come from a separate universe. My mail wasn't color-coded, my mailbox was slightly crooked, my hedges weren't trimmed to her specifications. It was overwhelming, ridiculous, and completely exhausting. Neighbors had begun to gather along the street, drawn by the rising tension. Some whispered supportively, some murmured in disbelief, and a few, more mischievous, raised their phones as if to capture the escalating drama for posterity. Every word I spoke felt like it had to be carefully measured. One false step, and Karen would escalate even further. I tried a different tactic. "Look, Karen, I understand you want everyone to follow the rules, but I live here. I locked my door, that is all. There's no danger, no emergency, and no reason to involve the entire neighborhood." She scoffed. "Rules aren't just about emergencies. It's about precedent. If one person starts locking doors without warning, next thing you know, the whole neighborhood will be in chaos." At that moment, I realized the absurdity had reached its peak. A simple locked door was somehow a symbol of chaos, a harbinger of neighborhood collapse. And yet, I could feel the suspense in the air, the palpable tension that made even small movements feel monumental. Neighbors were holding their breath, waiting to see if Karen would storm off, or if I would finally crack under the pressure. Her son appeared, trailing behind her like an eager assistant in a courtroom drama, nodding vigorously as if to emphasize every point his mother made. I imagined him later, recounting the story to anyone who would listen. "We almost lost the neighborhood because someone locked their door." I took a slow breath, trying to remain calm. "Karen, this is my house. Locking a door is normal, it's responsible, it's not a threat. And the more you escalate this, the more ridiculous it looks to everyone watching." For a brief moment, Karen faltered, scanning the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered. Some were smirking, some whispering supportively to one another. I could sense the shift. Her theatrics had lost some of their power now that the audience had subtly turned against her. The suspense tightened, though, because I knew she wasn't done. She never was. She threw her hands in the air dramatically. "Fine, but don't think this ends here. I will take this to the HOA." I nodded. "Then we'll see them there. I'll explain everything clearly. But my door will stay locked, just in case you were wondering." She glared at me, clearly frustrated that her dramatic flair had been met with calm logic. Her son tugged at her sleeve, probably reminding her that she still had the power of influence, the chance to escalate. Neighbors slowly drifted away, whispering, some laughing quietly at the absurdity, some shaking their heads. The suspense lingered, though, like a storm cloud that hadn't yet released its rain. As I walked back to my house, I realized something important. Karen's obsession had elevated a minor issue into a full-scale drama, but I had survived it. The tension was still thick in the air, but for now, I had kept my ground. The next challenge was inevitable, the official HOA showdown, but I felt a quiet sense of confidence. The locked door had become more than just a lock. It had become a symbol of standing your ground, even when the odds were absurdly stacked against you. And I knew the next act would be even more suspenseful. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I felt a mix of anticipation, dread, and a strange amusement. The simple act of locking my own door had escalated to a full-scale neighborhood spectacle, and now it was going to be decided in an official setting. I dressed carefully, not because it mattered, but because there's something about facing an audience that makes you want to look competent, calm, and maybe even heroic. As I stepped into the community center, I immediately noticed the tension in the air. Neighbors filled the room, some whispering nervously, some openly grinning at the absurdity of it all. At the front of the room, Karen sat like a commander ready for battle, clipboard in hand, her son perched beside her with a smug expression. She was radiating confidence, as if she already knew the board would side with her. I took a deep breath and approached the podium. The suspense was electric. Every eye in the room seemed to be watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. Karen started immediately, launching into a detailed account of my dangerous behavior. She spoke passionately, emphasizing safety, responsibility, and community standards, painting a picture of a neighborhood on the brink of collapse, all because I had locked my door. I listened, quietly noting the reactions of the board members. Some exchanged glances, raising eyebrows at the dramatic flair, while others jotted notes, perhaps to remind themselves of the absurdity. The suspense hung in the air, thick and almost tangible, like a fog that refused to lift. I realized the stakes weren't just about a door anymore. They were about control, influence, and Karen's relentless need to dominate the narrative. When it was my turn, I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to address concerns about my door. The truth is simple. I live here, I locked my door, and no one is in danger. That's it. There's no emergency, no threat, and no reason for this to escalate further." Karen's eyes narrowed, clearly expecting outrage or panic from me, but I remained composed. The suspense built as she tried to interject, waving her hand like she was conducting an orchestra of complaints. I raised a finger gently, signaling that I wasn't finished. "Please, let me finish. I understand the desire for community safety, but this situation has been exaggerated beyond reason. Locking a door is normal. It's responsible. It's not a violation of any rule." The board members leaned in, listening closely. The room seemed to hold its breath. Karen sputtered, trying to counter every word, but the momentum had shifted. Neighbors shifted in their seats, some stifling smiles, others nodding in quiet support. The suspense was nearly unbearable. One false word, and the meeting could tip back in her favor. Karen tried one last dramatic push. "But think about the precedent. If one person locks their door, next thing you know," her voice trailed off as the room collectively processed the absurdity. I could see the board exchanging looks, silently questioning the logic of the argument. The suspense tightened. Every heartbeat felt amplified as the climax approached. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to command attention. "The precedent has already been set. Countless people lock their doors every day without incident. This is my home, and I am within my rights to secure it. I hope we can all agree that common sense should prevail here." A brief silence followed. Karen's son fidgeted beside her, clearly sensing the shift in the room. Neighbors whispered softly, the tension breaking just enough for nervous chuckles to ripple through the audience. The suspense hadn't disappeared, it was hovering, waiting, but it had transformed. It was no longer fear, it was anticipation for the resolution. Finally, the board chair spoke, voice calm and deliberate. "After hearing both sides, it's clear that no violation occurred. This matter is dismissed." The words hit the room like a wave, and the tension released in a collective exhale. Karen's jaw tightened, her fury barely contained. Her son slumped slightly in his chair, defeated. The suspense had reached its peak and collapsed, leaving a strange mixture of relief, amusement, and satisfaction in its wake. I stepped back from the podium, trying to hide my smile. Neighbors whispered congratulations, and a few even clapped quietly, acknowledging that the saga had reached its conclusion. Karen was still fuming, but now she had nowhere left to escalate. The suspense was finally spent, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of having stood my ground in the most absurd of circumstances. As I left the meeting, I realized something important. A locked door had become a symbol, not of danger, but of resilience. I had faced a neighborhood united against reason and had emerged victorious. The suspense had carried me through, keeping everyone on edge, but in the end, common sense had prevailed. And I knew the final act, the sweet resolution back at home, would be the cherry on top of this ridiculous, suspense-filled story. Finally, it was over. The HOA had dismissed Karen's complaint, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The tension that had been building for what felt like an eternity began to lift, leaving a strange mixture of relief and triumph. I walked back to my house, the familiar sight of my locked door now feeling like a small victory flag planted in the battlefield of suburban absurdity. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and let out a deep sigh. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of dinner from earlier, the gentle creak of the floorboards, everything was exactly as it should be. The chaos outside, the police cars, the letters, the neighbors' whispers, and Karen's dramatic interventions, they all seemed distant now, like a bizarre dream I had somehow survived. My phone buzzed. A neighbor had sent a text. "Congratulations on surviving Karen." I laughed quietly, shaking my head. It was true. Surviving Karen's fury over a locked door felt like earning a Medal of Honor in the most ridiculous competition imaginable. I replied with a simple emoji, a small smirk, because sometimes words couldn't capture the absurdity of what had just happened. I glanced out the window and noticed Karen standing across the street, her arms crossed, glaring at my house. Her son was beside her, looking sheepish and defeated. It was a sight both satisfying and amusing. The suspense of the past week had finally dissipated, leaving behind the quiet satisfaction of knowing that reason had won, even in the face of relentless drama. Later that evening, I locked my door again. Not out of fear, not out of defiance, but as a small reminder to myself. This is my home, and I make the rules here. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place felt oddly empowering, like a final exclamation mark on the absurd story that had taken over my neighborhood. Neighbors passed by, some giving cautious nods, others smiling in quiet solidarity. A few whispered, clearly amused, while a couple of curious onlookers pretended not to stare. I realized that in a strange way, this ordeal had strengthened my connection to the neighborhood. They had witnessed my resilience, my calm in the face of chaos, and maybe, just maybe, they respected it. As the sun set, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, I reflected on the absurd journey. A locked door, something so simple, had triggered a chain reaction of dramatic proportions. Sirens, police, neighborhood gossip, HOA complaints, and theatrical confrontations. It was like living inside a reality show, and yet it had all been real. I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. Only in suburban America could something as ordinary as locking your door turn into a full-blown spectacle. Only Karen could have escalated a minor act of privacy into an event that captivated an entire neighborhood. And only me could have survived it all with my sanity, and my sense of humor, mostly intact. That night, as I prepared for bed, I locked my door one last time, the sound echoing like a victory bell. The neighborhood was quiet, the suspense finally gone. Karen had been defeated, her son had been humbled, and I had reclaimed my peace. The absurdity of the situation remained, but now it was a story I could tell with laughter instead of stress. I lay in bed, thinking about how a simple act could ripple into something so dramatic. I realized that sometimes standing your ground, even over something as small as a locked door, is worth the effort. It's about asserting your rights, your independence, and your sanity, no matter how bizarre the opposition may be. And with that, I drifted off to sleep, knowing that my door was locked, my home was safe, and my neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes common sense prevails, and sometimes a locked door is the most powerful statement you can make. The saga was complete. Suspense, drama, humor, and a little triumph over absurdity. My home was mine, the neighborhood was still standing, and Karen had been humbled, at least for now. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.